Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. My name's Hemingway Jones and I'm coming to you today from my library to talk about another exciting aspect to fountain pens. And that's something I've been obsessing over since I got into this hobby, I don't know, some 30 years ago. Because when you think of a pen, one of the most important parts of it is where it touches the paper and how it actually makes the impression you want to make. So today, without further ado, I'd like to give you some of my opinions on fountain pen nibs. So I've been into fountain pens now since the 1980s, and I really got into it in the 90s. And one of the things that I really have loved and still love about the hobby is how it could really differentiate your handwriting. So for me, it's been one long experiment in creating different lines, different ways of expressing myself, and different ways of producing individualistic words, lines, and phrases. And I'll tell you what I mean. Have you ever looked at old letters? I don't even mean ones from your grandparents, but go all the way back to 100 years ago. Have you seen the old historic letters when people were using different nibs, different fountain pens, all kinds of stubs, all kinds of flex pens? It was the golden age of fountain pens. And you see, everyone had a very individualistic style in their writing, whether it went from thin to fat or had really extravagant loops. It was all drawn almost like calligraphy. I would maybe make the argument that that which survives shows better examples of their handwriting, so it's slightly skewed. But nevertheless, it's certainly something to aspire toward. This fantastic, expressive, and interesting handwriting. So when I got into the hobby, and even right now, I'm trying to achieve that, and I still really haven't. I learned the Palmer method of cursive writing in the 1970s as a school kid in Philadelphia, and it's a very pedestrian, sort of middle of the road style of writing, and any sort of affectations that I've tried to attach to it over the years just looks artificial now. I'd love to have more of a Spencerian hand or something a little bit more dramatic, but it just doesn't seem to work for me. Whatever those nuns taught me back in the 70s just seems so ingrained that I am more apt to simply craft very easy to read but less interesting script. So as I write, I'm trying to make my handwriting more interesting more than anything else. I think the two things it must be is legible and interesting. So I think I've achieved the former, and the latter is always slightly out of grasp, but it's something to aspire toward. So toward that end, I found for me that medium and fine nibs just seem kind of boring for the most part now, especially fine nibs. Now, certainly the experience of writing with some of them can be great. The fine nib on the hover pen is a Schmidt nib. It's very smooth. The fine nib on a TWSBI is fantastic. I've written with fine points on Lamis. They're all great, but the line that it draws is very reminiscent to a ballpoint. It's very even, very regular, at least in my hand. So I do find that the fine point is fine enough that it makes getting line variation very difficult, except in regards to pressure, and these nibs are so smooth that you really can't press very much anyway. Similarly, I find that medium nibs are just a bit wider than a fine and often suffer from the same issue. Unless they're cut in such a way that the corners are square, and then if you're very disciplined with your nib and you draw that straight line down, your diagonal lines and your horizontal lines will be much thinner. But that's a rare nib, although I have seen it most recently on my Diplomat Aero. It seems to cut a very thick line down and a thinner one going up. The Schaefer Legacy from the 2005 or so is more of a uniform, very flowy, wet nib. Some of the other ones that I found that are extraordinary medium nibs is like the nib in the Mont Blanc 149 Meisterstück. That is a very sensitive and interesting nib where I get line variation with the slightest gradients in pressure. And it's mostly the weight of the pen and just a bit more, just a 1/1000th of a gradient more gives you a thicker, thinner line. It's a bit unruly. It's a bit difficult to master, but once you get it going, it is really amazing. Similarly, the medium nib on the Mont Blanc Egyptomania reminds me quite a bit of the nib on a Waterman 52.5, or Waterman 52 for that matter. These soft flex nibs in the 1920s and 30s and even the 40s, they're something to aspire toward, and it seems like the modern manufacturers have not achieved it. There's some great soft nibs out there, but there aren't very many great flex nibs. So the Pinator Ultra Flex is a very soft, wonderful nib to write with. Doesn't give you much line variation. Similarly, the Mont Blanc Egyptomania is fantastic to write with, but doesn't give a lot of line variation. But I'm okay with that. It still gives a lot of personality, a lot of fat to thin through the expressive line and those tiny variations in pressure and sensitivity. So as my interest in this hobby has evolved, I'm finding myself getting more and more away from these fine and medium nibs and going more toward stubs, towards cursive italic. I love the cursive italic nib in my TWSBI VAX 700R. It makes it such a wonderful journaling nib, and it's one of those nibs that you need to give yourself over to get the most effect out of it. Cursive nibs are best when you're writing with abandon. The quicker and the smoother you write, the more amazing the line variation is. Stub nibs, you can write very disciplined and get that nice line variation. You can tell from the way I'm speaking that line variation means a lot to me. I am just trying to get something a bit more interesting so that when you get a letter from me and you open it up, it's going to be very expressive, very individualistic. I'm going to be thinking about how I'm crafting my words, which ink I'm using, and which pen. Even choosing which pen to use is an element of style. And that's a video for another day. I hope you stay tuned for that. But as I evolve, I just want more interesting writing. And I think maybe you do too. Isn't that why we all got into this hobby? So what do you think? Are you happy with just fine and medium lines? Are you someone who considers themselves an extra fine nib person or a fine nib person, and each pen you buy has those nibs? Or a medium nib, is that your signature line? Or are you looking for something more or something different? Are you looking for the perfect flex nib like the Blue Dew, which is a fantastic flex nib, or something vintagey like the Waterman 52? Vintagey is a new word I just created. What is it that you're looking for? I'd love to hear in the comments. I hope you've enjoyed this video today. I've certainly enjoyed talking to you. It's been great speaking to each of you in the comments. There's not that many people that follow this channel, so it's really fun to get to know each of you and to discuss things as we evolve and we move along in search of the perfect writing experience. So stay inspired, my friends. If you would, please like this video, leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. If you didn't like this video and you made it this far, let me know what I'm doing wrong. I'd like to hear that too.